who am I and what's my background? Well, maybe I could say as a start that I consider myself to be a theorist and not an artist. I'm very happy that I have the chance to work with a lot of artists, and that I'm also working at an art school since about 2.5 years, and I've been teaching in different art schools in the Netherlands also for many years, and therefore I have a very nice a connection to art and art making, but still from my own practice as a theorist. So my background is in philosophy. I studied. Oh, now thank you, Catalina. I forgot to spotlight myself. Can you all see me now? Okay, good. I studied philosophy and gender studies in Vienna a long time ago, and then I moved to Amsterdam to do my doctorate studies in cultural analysis. And that's an important step for me. It seems almost, in retrospect, it seems almost the only thing I could have done, because I've always been working with theories of the body. I've always been interested in the body and how the body appears in philosophy and what philosophy does with the body. And I've always been very frustrated about how philosophy deals with the body. And when I moved to cultural analysis, I realized that I could have a totally different approach to the body there, because theory in cultural analysis is not just used as a tool to talk about something, but it's actually seen as a practice itself. So it's a practice of analyzing culture and art and artworks and everything that we are interested in. And so what happened in this shift from philosophy to cultural analysis was that I could treat the body not anymore as an object of theory, but all of a sudden I could look at the body within artworks or literary works as a subject of art. And then I could analyze those objects of art through my theory. So all of a sudden the body became a much more active agent in my theorizing, and that's a very important step, I think, also when it comes to how theory can be used for art, I think, because it very much depends on what kind of theory we're using. So anyway, so the body as well as art became a sort of interlocutor for me in my theory, and not so much anymore the object that I would be analyzing through theory. At the moment, I'm teaching and doing research in art education at the Zurich University of the Arts, and I'm still connected to the Netherlands. I've been teaching in the Netherlands for a long time at the University of Amsterdam, and then later at the Sandberg Institute, and still at the Rietveld Academy and at the Piet Zwart Institute in Rotterdam. But unfortunately now very often just online rather than physically in place. And so what I've been trying to do in the past few years was not just write about the body, but actually much more try to find ways of writing with and from the body, which is the place also where I connect to artists who have done that already ever since they've done art, is to think and to perform and to write and to make visual works from their own body, rather than just about the body. So why am I interested in vulnerability? Well, you will see in a second when I'm sharing my screen and show you a few slides, is that I'm not interested just in the common sense of vulnerability, and I will also tell you how and why and what I mean by that. But how was I becoming interested in vulnerability and vulnerable looking? Well, first of all, within my work in cultural analysis, I looked at different concepts of vision and visuality in literature. And I did that because I got interested in bodies that were talked about in literature, or that were figuring in literature, that were exceeding the norms of embodiment. So there weren't like the typical types of bodies that could just be called men or women or whatever, large or small or etc. And I felt that literature was using visuality and visual tools in order to make sense of bodies that we have no names for. So in language, we could not talk about these bodies because there are no categories for bodies that are other, for example, monstrous bodies or some types of disabled bodies, etc. And so what was interesting for me to look at was how literature used visual, the visual sense, the imagination of how we can see those bodies other than through language in order to make them appear in literature. So that's how I came to the idea of looking, and how looking in literature functions differently from how I just look at something with my eyes. So it happens through a totally different process, through language and through imagination. Anyway, so what happened was that I realized that if we want to rethink norms about bodies like gender, race, or ability, it was not enough to criticize those categories, but to actually rethink the practices that are involved in perpetuating these practices or these categories. So, and one of them is, for example, language, right? We all know that, like when we relearn to use personal pronouns, we can actually make a different impression on what we say for people. And when we look at people differently, that was my theory, then we can also make a difference in how people would feel about their bodies that might not be part of a very specific category or a specific norm. Well, then the second interest appeared to me that because I've been working a lot with artists and theorists with disabilities, and I realized that even working together with people with different types of disabilities made me very much aware of how I'm making assumptions about specific types of practices that I just take for granted. And other people cannot take them for granted. And I realized that, if I wanted to work with these people, I had to become more vulnerable about my own practices. So I had to not take for granted how I hear something and how I see something, and that I even, knew how to walk on two legs, for example, but that I would have to, become aware that this is also, even my own seeing and my own hearing and my own walking are in fact constructions and cultural trainings that I could also do differently, that I could think differently about. They became habits, but why do they have to just be that way and not another way? So then what I also realized that working on these concepts and these ideas about bodily practices that were involved in my theory making was, of course, that there are never individual practices, even though I might think that my walking on two legs is an individual practice of my own body. But in fact, the expectation that someone should be able to walk on two legs is a social expectation or a cultural expectation. And when it comes to looking and what we see or how we read, for example, then it becomes even more extreme. So these practices, even though I might think these are my own because I'm doing them with my own body, they're in fact social practices. And so they're always shared practices. And therefore, that was my hope, was that if I change those practices, that I might have an influence on cultural practices of looking at bodies that might have an effect on changing norms around bodies. So to make more space for those monstrous bodies that in literature had a lot of space, have always had in quite a lot of space because of the use of visuality. Okay, so that's my introduction, and for now I would like to share my screen. Let me see if I can do that. I'm not so used to Teams, so, but I think I can do it. I practiced yesterday with Catalina.
It's the square with the arrow.
Yeah, I think I'm there. I'll just see if this works. You have to tell me. All right, there it is. Okay. All right. So some of the questions I want to be asking, and I also asked for the text that I wrote, was how can the concept of vulnerability become a tool for practicing artists and not just for theory makers? And then the second question was, how can theory be useful in this endeavor? How can we use theory for this? And then what does disability have to do with it? So these are very simple questions, but they're actually quite complicated to answer. So I'm not going to give you any answers. I'm just posing them and hopefully we can have a discussion about them later. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about vulnerability. So most of you know, of course, the most common definitions of vulnerability, which are, could be called the humanitarian definitions of vulnerability, as the idea that someone is vulnerable and we need to help this person, that kind of definition. So what this definition would say about vulnerability is that it's the possibility to be hurt or influenced, mostly negatively. It is also the condition to be exposed to injury or attack. And it is a state of weakness and exposure to violence. So, of course, I'm saying a little bit, maybe negatively, that I'm not interested in the common definition of vulnerability. But of course, I am, because the common definition of vulnerability will always be part of any concept of vulnerability. So let's not forget, that common sense idea of vulnerability. But what I'm more interested in is the critical concept of vulnerability, and you will hopefully see why. Well, I'm referring here to a concept of vulnerability that Judith Butler is most famous for having developed. But of course, there are a lot of other, mostly feminist theorists who have worked on that concept. So she's just one of the people. So what this concept means is that vulnerability is always something that is relational. It is never just something that belongs to one person, independent of other persons. So we are always vulnerable because we are radically dependent on others. We could never survive on our own. And others could also mean other animals, for example, not just other human beings. But we are also vulnerable because we are dependent on the material and the social world which sustains us or which fails to sustain us. And I wrote here dependency and precariousness because precariousness is one of the states that we can end up in if the conditions of living for some people are, like worse than for others, and who are, more failed by their environment to survive. So what this means is that the dependency in vulnerability on the surrounding world is not the same for everyone, right? So that's also important to keep in mind. So we are all vulnerable. We are all vulnerable to each other, but we are not vulnerable necessarily in the same way. Depending on the conditions, they're often, like political conditions or colonial conditions or whatever. Another interesting aspect of the critical concept of vulnerability is vulnerability as openness. That means we are vulnerable because we are open to affect and to be affected. So we are open to feel and sense something, and we are open to affect others. So we can only live in the condition of being part of an environment to which we always respond and which responds to us. That is the definition, more or less, of life, I would say. Living organisms. But that makes us, the living part of the living organism makes us vulnerable to our environment because we're dependent on that response and the responsiveness. And here I also wrote permeability, because it also means that even if we think of our body as ending at our skin, we are in fact permeable, because that openness that is the condition for our being alive also goes both ways, right? Permeability is always something that goes through in both directions. So the responsiveness doesn't necessarily just come from one direction to another. All right. So just to summarize a little bit. So the first concept of vulnerability, which is the more common one, means to be vulnerable is to be weak, exposed, isolated, and in need of defense or protection, and to be passive. That, let's not forget, that's an important definition of vulnerability as well, and we will always keep it. So vulnerability means dependency on social and material relations, which puts us more or less at risk of injury, illness, poverty, discrimination, etc., and of social inequalities that exist around us. The second concept of vulnerability, which is more critical, means to be vulnerable is to be responsive to the world and to others, to be able to act and to affect the world and these others. So vulnerability gives us the capacity to respond, which allows subjects to act or to have agency, which is a very nice term in English. It's not translatable into German, and I don't know if there is a good translation in Dutch, unfortunately, but in English it works perfectly. To have agency is to have the capacity or the ability to act and to have influence. And it also means that we can resist or fight whatever precarity and inequality we're in. So this second part of the critical aspect of vulnerability is important because it leads precisely to what I want to say about vulnerable looking, making a long way short. It means that looking is not passive, that vulnerable looking is not something passive, but that vulnerability actually allows us to be, to act, right? To respond and to have agency and to resist the conditions within which we live. All right. So now we come to the practice of looking. What I want to say here is, referring back to what I said before, is that looking isn't something that just happens to us. Looking is something that we actively do. But very often, because we're so habituated in looking, that we think our eyes do whatever they do and we have no influence on whatever. But so that's why we need a critical concept of looking. We need to analyze how looking is actually an act that we participate in and that we have choices about. So the critical concept of looking involves, again, the word agency of the seeing and the looking subject. So I have to recognize that I have agency, but also a certain, responsibility when I'm looking. Then looking should be understood as a bodily, culturally trained and social practice or act. So it's not just, as I said before, it's not just an individual act. It's not just something that I do at this very moment, but it's been, socially trained and culturally accepted and etc. Looking is also a political act, and I'm saying political here as in, you've heard this before, education is never neutral. Education is always political, and the same goes for looking. Like the practice of looking is also political. It's never just neutral. I can never have a look of something, like a view of something that is neutral, because that wouldn't mean anything to me. Meaning only comes with the conditions of knowing something and of making sense of what I see. And so that's why it's a political act also. Then looking is also an ethical response. I can choose to look or not to look, and I can choose how I want to look. So it's an ethical response to the world, but you could also call it an ethical responsibility to the world. You know, when I'm capable of looking at others, then it comes with a certain responsibility of how I do that looking. Okay, so vulnerable looking involves visual objects, acts of looking, and or encounters with others. So it's always a shared practice. It also involves awareness that our vision is culturally constructed. What I said before, it could be different, right? Because in different cultures, looking is different. So that's like my attempt to make a change of the status quo or of changing, bodily norms is to think, how can I look differently in order to change the world? And then it also involves awareness of our own culture or habits of looking that have effects on what I can see and on who I look at. So what I want to say with this is that it again refers to the responsibility I have when I look at something or someone, is that my looking can actually have an effect on that which, look or on the person I see. And this is especially crucial for people with disabilities who have experienced for I don't know, since ever, the wounding looks of people who cannot make sense of their bodies because they've been so trained to only see specific types of bodies as human beings and other types of bodies as monsters. And so they're looking at bodies with specific disabilities, for example, is a hurting look for these people. Okay. So how does disability theory and art practice go together? Well, what does disability theory and art practice tell me for my own practice? Well, they both allow me, or especially disability allows me to reveal the potential failures or the vulnerability of the capacity to look. I could lose my sight, for example. That's just one of them. Then the other things are kind of repetitions of what I said before, but I'm just going to the last point here, which is that looking is a perceptive practice and is part of art making when we make art. So instead of thinking that art making involves just, the kind of crafts that we would think that art making involves, sculpturing, working with material, etc., whatever. No, the practices that are involved in, everything visual and our own looking are actually part of that art making process. Okay, so that's how these two come together. Now, very quickly, because I see it's already it's already time. I'm just gonna say a few words about my encounters with Marc Quinn's artworks, and that relates to how I practice theory, if you want. You might be surprised to hear that I've actually never seen these artworks in space. But what's important about my relationship to these artworks is that I've encountered them through personal stories and pictures that friends of mine have made of these artworks. And so these artworks came to me through a story and through personal experience. So rather than having this experience by myself in space in London or in Venice, I've had these artworks mediated through personal stories and experiences of others. And so that's something that I always like to work with, because I feel like that's how I experience the world, is through sharing it with others. And here are just very few pictures. You can see the immensity of the sculpture of Alison Lapper. I'm not going to say much about this, maybe just very quickly that, Marc Quinn is a very successful artist. He makes sellable art, which probably says everything about how he survives. But also, he's not unpolitical. I mean, he's interested, for example, in bringing disability into the public sphere, which is already something rather special for a rather mainstream artist. So he makes an effort of making political statements with his art as well. Maybe one of the contradictions that I could just mention about Marc Quinn's artwork is that with Alison Lapper as one of his most famous models, you could say, for his art, it's interesting that, you know, he is this very successful artist that makes also much, you know, a lot of money with the kind of art that he makes about Alison Lapper. And Alison Lapper is also a practicing artist, and she's much less successful than Marc Quinn. And I just want to say that, you know, like even in art and even in political art, you know, we already realize how, you know, there is inequalities in how people have access to the world and to financial means and to influence. And so here, this is just one of the examples. You know, this is not to say that Marc Quinn shouldn't have worked with Alison Lapper. It's just to say this, you know, are the conditions within which artists find themselves a lot on both sides. Well, these images I'm showing because one of these images was how I got to know about the artwork made by a friend of mine who lived in London at the time and photographed the artwork. And what you see are the pigeons. And so there's, in both pictures, there's a pigeon on the head of Alison Lapper, of the sculpture. And what I want to say, and I show it with the next artwork, is that, you know, that made me think about the artwork already differently. Because whatever I say about the artwork in my article, that, you know, its material is so shiny and clean and etc., kind of loses its relevance when we look at the artwork differently, and when we can actually see that, you know, this artwork is inhabited by a world of pigeons, for example, but also by other beings. So this sculpture is also part of an environment that engages with the artwork in different ways. So this is the other artwork, Breath, that is based on the sculpture. And, you know, in the article we will see later in the passages, I'm also referring to this artwork more. But you can also see here the immensity of the artwork. And again, two pictures. I don't know if you can see it here, but you can see I wrote with the pigment. So the second picture is a picture of the artwork where you can actually see that the skin is never just, you know, like you know, one color, but that it actually made of pigments, and that these pigments, you know, change depending on, you know, like conditions and, you know, skin conditions, but also environmental conditions and lighting conditions, etc. So they're always exposed to change. And in this picture, in the left picture, you can see, you know, almost like skin-like structures with folds and creases, etc., which makes the artwork already look much different. So what I like to say before we go to the passages that I picked from my text is that what I find interesting to look at representations of artworks that might be, you know, sculpture somewhere, is that it allows me to think about representations in general and about what art does with its representative function when it comes to bodies. So I'm asking myself, how can we, or how do we, depict bodies in art? And how do we visualize and imagine bodies in pictures? And further, how do these images and imaginations relate to bodies in reality? Do they have any connection? And how do these pictures of bodies influence how we see our own and other bodies? And so this last question is the one that's, you know, driving me, because my theory is that, yes, if we do make different pictures of bodies, then we can actually see bodies differently. They would teach us to look at bodies differently. The question is now, what kind of pictures and what kind of images do we need to make of bodies that they would actually be able to teach us something else about how we can look at bodies in reality? Okay, that would be then the task of art, I think, to do that.